You're watching Clear Cut. Welcome back. In just a few hours, the 8th round of Syrian peace talks will begin in Geneva. Now, for the first time, various Syrian opposition groups will be presenting a unified front in negotiations with the government. But the fighting on the ground continues, adding to the urgency and the hopes that this round of talks will actually deliver a lasting peace. I-24 News Middle East correspondent Michael Pluchok has more.
Just days before the 8th round of talks were to begin, the Assad regime intensifying its onslaught, killing dozens of civilians in eastern Ghouta. But the man leading the negotiations is still optimistic.
This crisis, one of the worst in the history of the UN, now has the potential, real potential, to move towards a genuine political process.
Russia is supposed to bring the Syrian regime to the table, and a regime delegation is expected to attend the Geneva talks Wednesday. In contrast, the Saudis created a new opposition grouping to attend the talks. And for the first time, the different opposition factions will be represented by a single, unified delegation. One sticking point so far has been the opposition demand that Bashar al-Assad be removed from power. But the United Nations mediator in Geneva doesn't want to hear of preconditions.
Let me make one thing clear. We will not accept any precondition from either party.
Precondition or not, the opposition is still demanding that Assad play no part in future Syria.
We don't support preconditions. We are here to negotiate, but our goal in the negotiation will be the departure of Bashar al-Assad from the beginning of transition.
But the Assad must leave demand has become increasingly detached from reality on the ground in Syria. With help from Russia and Iran, the regime has managed to retake much of the territory it lost in the civil war. And meanwhile, Russia launched its own round of talks last week, separate from the Geneva process in Sochi. And even opposition leaders already recognize Russia as the more influential superpower.
We are still waiting to know whether Russia intends to reach a political solution, because it's the only actor capable of bringing the regime to the negotiating table.
Now that global powers are no longer interested in fueling the Syrian conflict, there is a chance of instilling calm. But the reason the war broke out in the first place, to remove the Syrian despot, seems further away than ever. Michael Pluchok, I-24 News.
Meanwhile, Israel's defense minister seemed to temper fears of a growing Iranian military presence in Syria. In an interview published on Tuesday, Avigdor Lieberman said that there is, quote, no physical Iranian military presence in Syria, and that Tehran's strategy is to create proxies. Let's bring in I-24 News correspondent Sarah Coates live from our Tel Aviv headquarters. And Sarah, good to see you. Those comments from Lieberman, they seem to contradict warnings from Prime Minister Netanyahu about Iran's role in Syria. What's going on?
Yeah, Michelle, they definitely seem to be a little out of sync there. Lieberman saying that the threat is coming from Iranian proxies, mostly Hezbollah, while Netanyahu says that Iranian troops are actually present in Syria building bases. But Lieberman believes there are just Iranian advisors and representatives there. Now, Netanyahu's been especially wary of the UN peace talks on Syria beginning in Geneva this week that could legitimise Iranian presence in Syria. If you also consider the threat Netanyahu issued to President Assad earlier this week, it looks like Netanyahu may be using more aggressive rhetoric in order to try and stop Iran from having a foothold in Syria after these talks.
Well, Sarah, meanwhile, we do have this Iranian-backed militia in Syria saying it's fully prepared to fight Israel if it's called upon to do so. Sarah, tell us more about who these guys are and how serious this threat is.
Yeah, well, it's a relatively new group that formed from Iraq's Shiite parliamentary forces in 2013 to fight in the Syrian war. The militia group openly receives training and arms from Iran and is partially controlled by Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, Iran's elite foreign operatives unit. Now, they have opened a new brigade, the Golan Liberation Brigade, with the name suggesting they'll want to harass the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights. Now, as we know, though, none none of the many militias in Syria are friends of Israel, that's for sure. But the fact is that this group is so closely linked to Iran means that Israel will be slightly more worried about them than any other group.
All right, Sarah, appreciate the update. All right, 24 News correspondent Sarah Coates. Right, let's further discuss those Syrian peace talks with Ryan Mauro, a national security analyst with the Clarion project. Ryan, good to see you. And Ryan, since 2012, there have been numerous rounds of negotiations and all have been essentially fruitless. So what are the chances of a breakthrough happening this time?
Very little. The most you might get is some type of agreement for a ceasefire in some area of Syria that then collapses. On the contrary, I actually think it's about to get a lot worse because Al-Qaeda has an army in Syria, and I think Al-Qaeda is a bigger threat than ISIS now. They are smarter, and they have a force of somewhere around 20,000 terrorists ready to go and fight and learn from ISIS' mistakes. In addition, you have different countries in the area that are looking to essentially carve up Syria into having numerous Berlin walls, except you have jihadists on each side. So it's the plan of Turkey and the Muslim Brotherhood is to have one section that crushes the Kurds and any secular democratic competitor, and then the plan of the other side is for the Russian-backed Shia extremists to control the rest of Syria.
Ryan, just to focus on what you said, that Al-Qaeda is now the biggest threat in Syria, or a growing threat?
Oh, without a doubt. They're smarter than ISIS now. They've sat back and they've said, what do we do to not repeat the mistakes of ISIS and mistakes that Al-Qaeda made in the past? So they're developing social services, enhancing their propaganda techniques, and not acting overly aggressive so that there's a backlash. And I've got to tell you, it looks to be very successful.
Well, what is the dynamic between Al-Qaeda and Assad's forces?
Well, Assad has cynically and successfully used Al-Qaeda and even ISIS to his benefit. So they may hate each other and fight each other, but what we've seen, and Syrian dissidents that I worked with have warned about this for years, but what the Assad-Iranian strategy has long been, has been to say if there's going to be an opponent to Assad's rule, it's best for it to be a monster like Al-Qaeda. And that's why they've concentrated their power on secular, democratic, more moderate forces, and in some cases actually helped groups like Al-Qaeda rise up so that they can say, look, there's the monster that you need me to defeat. You may not like me, but you need me and my Iranian backers to fight Al-Qaeda and folks like them.
Right, that's an interesting strategy. Ryan, let's focus on these peace talks, round 8. All previous initiatives collapsed over the opposition demanding that Assad leave power and, of course, his refusal to go. So with Russia and Iran backing Assad, is it inevitable that he stays on in power?
For the short term, but there's always a possibility someone near him just kills him, whether because they want to take power or because they're fed up with everything. So I wouldn't rule out that possibility, but the idea of Assad surrendering, especially now, is really a fantasy. So you're going to have jihadists that just fundamentally believe in fighting Assad no matter what, and then you'll have more moderate forces on the ground that just are not willing to let Assad get by with this, and so they'll keep fighting. So I think that that's the recipe for fighting into the future, and that's not going to change. But what you could see happen is that Muslim Brotherhood type jihadists backed by Turkey and Qatar, unfortunately maybe the U.S., are going to try to reach a truce with Iran and Assad in most of Syria and say, you're jihadists, we're jihadists. Let's find a way to get along and focus on folks like the U.S., the Kurds, and Israel.
All right, Ryan, appreciate your perspective. Ryan Mauro, national security analyst with the Clarion project. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Straight ahead on the show, the fight over tax reform, why congressional Democrats skipped an invite to the White House. And later, the future of Venezuela's economy, what the government plans to do about its oil business.